We are continuing our time in Matthew chapter 5 and the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to be in a familiar passage, although frankly I probably don't need to say that any week that we're in the Sermon on the Mount. They're all kind of familiar passages here. But we are looking at Matthew chapter 5 verses 13 through 16. It says this, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." It's a very common desire for humans to want to influence other people around us. One of the best-selling books of the 20th century was How to Win Friends and Influence People, trying to explain what sort of personal strategies we should adopt in our relationships with other people to move them, to influence them. We might say to get them to do what we want them to do. We want to influence people. Now, today, if you look at polls of high school and junior high students, the number one desired occupation is an influencer. That's not even a real job. Yet, it is the number one desire. We like to influence people in all sorts of big and little ways. Like, I enjoy parenting sometimes. Other times, it's iffy. But in general, I like being a parent. I like the fact that I have 3 children who I can help to grow up to not be total psychopaths. That is a noble goal. I like to have influence on my kids. I like to talk to my kids and hear what they're thinking and interact with them. We like to influence other people. No one dreams that one day they will pass away, they will die, and everyone will forget that they ever existed. That's not what we live for. We want something good on the tombstone when we die, someone to remember us. Perhaps some of you have had times where you've moved, you've changed where you lived, you moved on from a job, and you look back and you see what you've left and you wonder, do they even know that I'm gone? Because we want to have an influence. Well, that's good because Jesus in this text calls us to be people who have an influence on the world around us. The world ought to look different because we are in it than it would if we were not in it. And so Jesus, coming off the Beatitudes, coming off these 8 countercultural characteristics that those who live as citizens of the kingdom will have, encourages his disciples to influence other people around them. And he does so through 2 different metaphors. The first metaphor is salt. Jesus calls the disciples to be salt. Now, this is a little bit of a challenging metaphor because it could mean a whole lot of different things, and it's not actually clear what it means. So salt, how does salt influence things? For one, it brings out flavor compounds, right? We put salt on our food to make it taste better. We take bland food, put salt on it, somehow it magically becomes not bland food. I'm sure there's some science there. I don't understand that. Like, no one wants to take a teaspoon of salt and be like, delicious. But you put it on everything you eat. And as someone with high blood pressure, I know it's on everything you eat. You have to get rid of it. But salt, it adds flavor. Salt's also a preservation agent. You put salt on meat and it preserves it for a long time. It has that preserving influence that goes beyond simply the flavor that it adds to meat. Salt also has a purifying aspect. And this text does not tell us in what way we are salt. Is it that we purify the world? Well, we could do a whole sermon on the church purifying the world. Is it that we make the world taste better or make it more well-seasoned? Probably do a whole sermon on that as well. Could do a whole sermon on us preserving the world. But the text doesn't give us any of that. What it does give us is the idea that salt has an effect on the world around it. Christians have an effect on the world around them. We are called to make a difference. We are called to be influential. The second metaphor he gives us is the metaphor of light. We are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In this way, light also has multiple meanings, and the text actually gives us both of the meanings. Light can serve as a way to identify something. It can help us find something. When you go driving down the road and you look off into the fields, you might see a TV tower or a wind turbine. And on top of that wind turbine, there's always a flashing light. I think of driving through Indiana where you have just whole massive fields of wind turbines, and it's dark. You can't even see them, and they're flashing. Why are they flashing? It's not so that you can see. Those little red lights on the top of a wind turbine are not very good at illumination. It is so that you see them if you're, say, flying an airplane, because that light helps you to see this tall tower so that you don't run into it. So light has that purpose of showing a place to go to or not go to, but it also has the effect of illumination, which is also brought about in this text, where we're in the dark and we take out a flashlight, or as the case may be today, you press that little button on your cell phone that turns your cell phone into a flashlight, and you use that to see what you're looking at. My wife and I ate at a fancy restaurant in Chicago Friday night, and were encountered with the fact that we were aging when we couldn't read the menu because it was too dark. Also too loud. Get off my lawn. And it was dark and loud in this restaurant, and we're both staring at it, just looking for illumination. We knew we were going to get tacos. We just didn't know what kind of tacos. And so we had to read to see the different types of tacos that were available to us. And we needed illumination to be able to see. We needed to shine a little extra light on the menu so that we could see. And Jesus uses both aspects of that metaphor in these verses. He says, a city on a hill that cannot be hid, something that is put in front so that as people are coming to the hill, they want to get there. It's dark, it's scary out there. They need to get to the city, and that city has light shining out of it, and it shows where safety is, a lighthouse outside a harbor, so that you can see the safe passage in. But also, it serves as illumination. The disciples of Jesus are like a lamp that gives light to everyone in the house. And so this text is not so much focused on let's really parse these metaphors and figure out the 5 ways that Christians are like light. They're the 3 ways that Christians are like salt. It's more making a broad strokes presentation that Christians influence the world around them. We ought to be people who are influential. So as we look at this text, I want us to see 3 characteristics of our influence as Christians. 3 characteristics of our influence as Christian. First of all, to be influential as a Christian, we must be different. We must be different. Salt and light are different from the things that they have an effect on. If you have a bland dish in front of you, you don't say, give me some more spaghetti so that I make it less bland. You don't add more of the thing that you already have. If you have a bland dish in front of you, you want to add something different. You add salt, that seasoning that flavors it. It is something different. When you put salt on meat to preserve it, it has some interaction at a molecular level with the water in the meat so that it is preserved. If you just throw more meat on the pile of meat, it's not going to help it be preserved, is it? Salt needs to be different from the thing that it is salting in order to have an effect. In the same way, light matters because light is different than darkness. Light outside, you take even a really bright flashlight in the middle of the day and you turn that flashlight on, it doesn't do much because it's already light there. When do we need light? When do we want to pull out our flashlight? We pull out our flashlight when it is dark outside, or when it is dark in the restaurant that's choosing ambience over clear legibility of their menu. When it is dark, that is when we need a light, because it is different from where it's shining. In the same way, the disciples of Jesus will only be effective and influential in their world when they are different from the world in which they live. You will not influence the world by being more like the world. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the English pastor from the 19th century, said this: "I believe that one reason why the Church of God at this present moment has so little influence over the world is because the world has so much influence over the church." If we look like the world, we will not affect the world. Salt and light add something new to their environment. They don't add more of the same. Yet Christians, it is incredibly tempting for us to look exactly like the world looks. Because if we look like the world looks, our life is going to be much more simple. We are going to feel more accepted. We are not going to have to defend views that may not be unpopular. We can protect our own interests rather than serving the interests of others. It will be easier for us to look exactly like the world in which we live. But then the world won't look any different because we're around. It's just more world added to it. And we will not be influential. So how exactly are we supposed to be different from the world in which we live? What should we do in order to be different? Should we wear lots of shirts that have the name Jesus on them and then say that we're being salt and light because we're wearing a shirt that identifies us on Team Jesus, much like we might wear a shirt that identifies us being on Team Green Bay Packers? Do we influence the world? Do we look different from the world simply by being weird? Like, the weirder we are, the more salty we are. The stranger habits that you have, you're different. Well, what is the context of Jesus calling the disciples to be salt and light? We're still in the same sermon of Jesus that we've been talking about for the past 2 weeks, because again, he preaches much shorter than me, because he preaches like 12 weeks worth of sermons in one. We're still in that same Sermon on the Mount. What was the last section? What was Jesus saying? He gave these 8 countercultural characteristics. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted." Salt and light looks different from the world because it looks like those 8 characteristics. If we follow after Jesus, we will be poor in spirit, mourning, meek, hungering and thirsting after righteousness. We will be merciful. We will be peacemakers. We will be persecuted. We will be pure in heart. And if we look like that, we will not look like the world. It goes much deeper than just the kind of cultural markers that we might use to signal, hey, we're Christians. We're Christians because we go to church on Sunday, which I'm a fan of. You should. We're Christians because we don't participate in some of the stuff that the world participates in. We're Christians because we do this and we look this way and we do that thing. We are Christians because when we follow Jesus, we look radically different than a world that follows itself. We look radically different than those who serve themselves, which is why it is so offensive when the church ministers in the world in such a way that serves itself, when we selfishly interact with our neighbors. We are doing things that fly in the face of the way that Jesus has called us to influence the world. At the end of this section, he summarizes it. Let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds. The way that we have an influence on the world is through our good deeds, through our faithfulness as we follow after Christ. We must be different from the world. But secondly, we must be engaged with the world. We must be engaged with the world. Withdrawing from the world is actually pretty attractive. Because if we are different, that's going to be difficult in the world in which we live. If I am concerned not about defending myself, not about preserving myself, but I am concerned about caring for others, being a peacemaker, being meek, if that's my heart, if that's my concern, I will be mistreated in the world. And so I might want to spend my time with people who agree with me about these Beatitudes, who are committed to practicing these Beatitudes themselves. I might want to withdraw from the world because it is hard to be in the world. The truth is, if we are in the world and we are like the world, that's going to be fairly easy. If we are not like the world, but we are not in the world, that will be fairly easy. The hard thing is for us to be in the world and different from the world. We cannot be so focused on being different from the world that we do not engage with the world, that we isolate ourselves into our little community with our friends, with our people, the ones who are easy for us to be around, the ones who are following Jesus alongside us, and then we can protect ourselves from all those nasty influences, from all the people who take advantage of our Christian ethics, if we just stay away from the world. But Jesus says that we are the salt of the earth, that we are light to the world. You cannot be salt and light if you have no contact with the world you're supposed to be salt and light in. You can't sit at your table with your bland food, look at the salt shaker and say, boy, I'm sure glad we've got a salt shaker on the table, and then keep on eating the bland food. The salt doesn't help if it's in the shaker. You have to actually put it on the food. And so many of us Christians, because we recognize that truly if we are different from the world, it will be hard. We will face persecution. We will face difficulty. We see that and we say, all right, I need to be different, so I'm going to be different with other people who are different and stay away from the world. And we withdraw ourselves from the world. We don't have connection with those who make our life harder, because in reality, being engaged with the world will often lead us to be uncomfortable. We will be around people who do things we wish they would not do, who say things that we wish they would not say. We'll have to have conversations with our kids because they see things that might be easier for us to not have to acknowledge exist in the world. It will be harder to engage with the world. It will be uncomfortable. There might be times when we face hostility in the world. It's really interesting in the Beatitudes. All 8 Beatitudes are in third person. Blessed are the poor in spirit, talking about a group of people. Blessed are those who mourn. And he goes through all 8 Beatitudes. The last one is, blessed are those who are persecuted, still in third person. But then in verse number 11, it says, blessed are you. He switches to second person. He switches to talking specifically to the disciples when he talks about persecution. And then he carries that second person over into the salt and light section when he says, you are the salt of the earth. Those who follow Jesus are the salt of the earth. You, if you follow him, it's personal. And it will be difficult. You will face hostility. You will face persecution. You will have your beliefs challenged. Sometimes It's nice to think that no one actually disagrees with me about anything because I can feel really secure in my beliefs. But then sometimes I run into the fact that other people think differently than me, and I actually have to have an answer ready. I have to be able to defend what I believe, and that is in and of itself often uncomfortable. We want to think that it's easy to think what we think. Yet we must be engaged in the world if we will be an influence over the world. Be engaged with the people in your workplace. Now, I understand work is work, and there are things you can and can't do at work. You may not be walking around your office like a street preacher, loudly shouting with picture illustrations of hell to illustrate the message that you're preaching at work. They're not going to be very influential at that job for very long. Right? Like there's limitations on how we can be influential. It's something that even my wife and I were talking about this week and trying to think through. How can she be salt and light as a public school teacher? There's limitations on how she can do that. Yet, we ought to be seeking the ways that we can faithfully and justly, not stealing from our employer, not causing problem that actually reduces our ability to influence people around us, but our workplace is a place for us to be salt and light. Your neighborhood is a place for you to be salt and light. Do you know your neighbors? Do you care for your neighbors? Do you try and find opportunities to point your neighbors to Jesus? We must be engaged with the world in which we live. We are not looking for a Christian compound where we can hide away and only spend time with other Christians. Because if we are doing that, we are not following Jesus. We are not salt and light. You cannot influence a world with which you are not engaged. But the end of this section raises a challenging question. It says, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Now, just the very next chapter, in the same sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6, Jesus says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So he says, in chapter 5, others will see your good works and glorify God. And then in chapter 6, he says, do your good works where people don't see your good works. How do we deal with that tension? Well, the final characteristic of being salt and light is that salt and light glorifies God. We will glorify God if we are salt and light. And that's the distinction between the righteousness of the Pharisees, which they did before mankind. That's the distinction between glorifying God, or between doing good things and being seen by others and doing good things to be seen by others. You see, Jesus says that a life of faithfulness to him will result in others glorifying God. The Pharisees did their good works in front of people so that others would glorify the Pharisees. The Pharisees wanted others to see that they were generous so that they would know that they were generous. The Pharisees wanted to care for the poor so that other people would know how much they cared for the poor. They were performers. They wanted to be seen. They wanted others to see what they were doing. Yet the reality is, if we are faithful to Christ, we will look different and other people will see our good works. But the point of the good works of someone being salt and light versus the point of someone doing good works as a Pharisee is that the person who is salt and light does his good works and other people see Jesus. They don't see him. They don't glorify him. They see God. If you are engaged with the world, and the difference in you, the way that you affect the world, is through these 8 characteristics, these 8 countercultural kingdom ethics of mourning and poverty of spirit, of peacemaking, of meekness, of mercy, if those things characterize you, they will show people what God is like. Because is there anyone more poor in spirit? The one who did not think it was robbery to be equal with God, but made him of no reputation and took upon himself the form of a servant? Is there anyone who's more poor in spirit than that? Is there anyone more meek than the one who was hung on a cross in spite of his absolute omnipotence, who heard his mockers, heard those who were crucifying say, "Come down from the cross if you're really who you say you are." And he was who he said he was, and he could come down from the cross, but in his meekness he did not. Is there anyone more merciful than the one who would leave heaven, the one who would leave his rightful place at the right hand of the Father and be born as an infant, completely dependent on his mother for life, to suffer life in a fallen earth? Is there anyone who's more like that than Jesus? If we live the way Jesus calls us to live in the Sermon on the Mount, others will look at us and see him. That is far different than living so that others look at us and see us. And so Jesus calls his disciples to be salt and light in the world, to have an effect on the world around them, to be different, but to be engaged, so that God would be glorified through their faithful lives. So let me ask you, how are you doing at being salt and light in the earth? Are you different than the world around you? Are you truly different? It's not here set up as being, well, I have different political opinions that I'm happy to share with everyone around me. No. Are you different in the way in which you live? When you are wronged in your office, do you look like Jesus in response? Or do you look just like everybody else? When you are hurt, do you look like Jesus? Or do you look like the world? Because that is your opportunity to be salt and light. In your home, where you have an obligation to be salt and light to your children, and your children are making it very hard to be salt and light to them. Are you faithfully different from the world, practicing the Beatitudes, or are you just seeking to get them to stop doing the thing that they're doing that is making your life worse? It's an opportunity for us to be salt and light. When you have a conflict with your neighbor because they're blowing their leaves onto your yard, are you salt and light? Or are you just more world piled on top of the world? We have an opportunity to be different, but we also must be engaged if we are to be different with any effect. A bunch of salt all piled together isn't very useful. The place in your house that has the most salt is not the place where salt is most useful. It's in a box in your cabinet. It's not doing anything up there. It's only useful when you pour it out, when you put it in what you're making, when you use it for its intended purpose. Christians, are you sitting in a box in the cabinet? Are you sitting in the salt shaker? Are you like a flashlight with the light turned off? If so, you're not doing anything. So be different, but be engaged, because there is a world around us that needs to see the glory of God. Are you passionate about the world seeing the glory of God? We frame evangelism usually in a compassion context. We see other people who do not know Christ, and we want them to know Christ because it's good for them. I don't think that's wrong. Right? I think Jesus does exactly that. So that is not a bad thing, but it's only part of the story. Are you passionate for evangelism? Are you passionate for others hearing the gospel so that Jesus gets the praise that is due to his name? That ought to motivate us to be salt and light, because there is a world that is not worshiping our beautiful, glorious Savior, and he deserves it. And so we want people to know about him. Our opportunity is to be salt and light so that the world around us will see our good works and Jesus will be praised. His name will be famous. He will be highly thought of. When we fail, oftentimes we make Jesus look bad. When we are not different from the world, we make Jesus look far less than he is. We rob glory from him. Yet he calls us to be salt, to be light, to be different, to be engaged, so that the world in which we live exalts and glorifies his beautiful name. Let's pray. Lord, it is not easy to be salt and light in the world in which we live. There are many things that really challenge us to look more like the world, to think more like the world, to be more like the world. And those things would stop us from having an influence on the place that you have put us. Those things would stop us from affecting the world around us as salt and light. I pray, God, that we would truly be different from the world by following after you, by applying these Beatitudes to our life so that we can show the world who you are. And Lord, I pray as we do that, that we would not retreat from involvement with those who need to see you, but that we would be engaged with them, that we would be connected with the world around us so that they would see you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.